The morning sun painted the Rolling Hills cattle ranch in gold, but ranch owner Sarah Martinez saw only red numbers bleeding across her foreclosure notice. 3 months. That's all the time left before her family's century-old ranch would be sold to developers. The cattle had been acting strange for weeks, restless, refusing to graze, some even escaping through perfectly good fences. Without calm livestock, there would be no income, and without income, no ranch. Sarah's 8-year-old daughter Emma hadn't spoken since her father's accident 6 months ago, and now they were about to lose the only home she'd ever known. That's when Barnaby appeared. The small grey donkey stood at the front gate like he'd been invited, ears perked, eyes bright with an intelligence that seemed almost human. The delivery truck driver swore he'd never seen the animal before, and there were no donkey farms for miles. Yet somehow, this 4-legged stranger carried himself like he belonged here. But what nobody knew was that Barnaby possessed a rare gift that would transform everything, a mysterious ability that could heal both animals and hearts. Could one little donkey really save an entire ranch and bring a family back together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah crumpled the foreclosure notice and shoved it into her back pocket, wiping dust from her weathered hands. The donkey hadn't moved from the gate, just stood there watching her with those impossibly knowing eyes. She'd been running this ranch single-handedly since Miguel's accident, and the last thing she needed was another mouth to feed. "Shoo!" She waved her arms. "Go on, get out of here." Barnaby tilted his head and let out a soft bray that sounded almost like laughter. He pushed against the gate latch with his nose until it clicked open, then trotted inside as if he owned the place. "Oh, for crying out loud," Sarah muttered, jogging after him. But the donkey was already making his way toward the cattle pasture, where her prized Angus herd was huddled in the far corner, looking agitated. The cattle had been her biggest problem lately. They wouldn't graze properly, which meant they weren't gaining weight, which meant the buyers weren't interested. Without the fall sale, the ranch would be finished even before the foreclosure deadline. As Barnaby approached the fence, something extraordinary happened. The cattle began to calm down. Their ears, which had been pinned back in anxiety, slowly relaxed. One by one, they started moving away from their defensive huddle. Sarah stopped running and stared. In all her years of ranching, she'd never seen anything like it. The donkey was just standing there, and somehow the cattle were responding to his presence like iron filings to a magnet. "Mom?" Sarah spun around to find Emma standing behind her. The word hit like a physical blow. It was the first time her daughter had spoken since that terrible day when Miguel's tractor had rolled down the hillside. "Emma, baby, you spoke." Sarah knelt down and pulled her daughter close, tears streaming down her face. Emma pointed at Barnaby with a small finger. "He's special, isn't he?" Before Sarah could answer, old Buck Thompson's pickup truck rumbled up the driveway. Buck had been their neighbor for 40 years and the closest thing to family they had left. He climbed out slowly, his arthritic joints protesting, and surveyed the scene with his weathered blue eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, scratching his grizzled chin. "Where'd that little fella come from?" "We have no idea," Sarah replied, still holding Emma tight. "He just showed up this morning, and the cattle, Buck, look at the cattle." The herd was now peacefully grazing, spread out across the pasture like a painting. The agitation that had plagued them for weeks seemed to have completely disappeared. Buck leaned against the fence, studying Barnaby with the keen eye of a man who'd spent his entire life around livestock. "You know, my grandfather used to tell stories about animals like this. Said there were some special ones who could calm a whole herd just by being near them. Thought they were just tall tales." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe that little donkey isn't lost. Maybe he's exactly where he's supposed to be." As if responding to their conversation, Barnaby wandered over to where they stood. Emma wiggled out of Sarah's arms and approached the fence, her small hand reaching through the rails. The donkey stepped forward and gently nuzzled her palm. "Can we keep him, Mom?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper but clear as a bell. Sarah looked at her daughter's face, seeing light in her eyes for the first time in months. Then she looked at her cattle, grazing peacefully for the first time in weeks. The foreclosure notice crinkled in her pocket as she shifted her weight. 3 months seemed impossible, but maybe, just maybe, impossible was exactly what they needed. The morning sun painted the weathered barn doors a soft amber as Sarah Martinez stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, and yesterday's worries already crowding her thoughts. The bank notice crumpled in her back pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step, its 30-day ultimatum echoing in her mind like a countdown timer she couldn't silence. She'd inherited more than just land when her father passed 6 months ago. She'd inherited his dreams, his debts, and his stubborn belief that the Martinez ranch could weather any storm. Problem was, this storm felt different, bigger, the kind that didn't just bend trees but uprooted entire lives. A peculiar braying sound cut through her brooding, followed immediately by shouting from the direction of the cattle pen. "What in the Sam Hill?" came her ranch hand Pete's voice, strained with a mixture of confusion and exasperation. Sarah quickened her pace, coffee sloshing over the rim of her mug. As she rounded the corner of the main barn, she stopped dead in her tracks. There, in the middle of her prized Angus cattle, stood what appeared to be a small grey donkey, calmly munching on hay while 23 very bewildered cows stared at him like he'd dropped from another planet. "Where did he come from?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't entirely sure if she was talking to Pete or the universe in general. Pete scratched his greying head beneath his worn Stetson. "Beats me, boss. Showed up sometime between last night's feed and this morning's count. Cows don't know what to make of him, but he seems right at home." The donkey in question, a compact fellow with oversized ears and intelligent dark eyes, looked up at them with an expression that could only be described as pleased. A few pieces of hay dangled from his mouth like a vegetarian's version of a cowboy's wheat stalk. "Well, we can't just leave him here," Sarah said, though even as the words left her mouth she wondered where exactly they were supposed to put him. The ranch was barely managing to feed the cattle they had, let alone take on another mouth. "Could try calling around, see if anyone's missing a donkey," Pete suggested, though his tone suggested he found this about as likely as finding a unicorn in the feed shed. Sarah nodded absently, already calculating the cost of an extra animal against their dwindling resources. The practical thing would be to call animal control, let them deal with it. The Martinez ranch wasn't a charity, and she couldn't afford sentiment when the bank was breathing down her neck. Sound of school bus brakes squealing in the distance reminded her that her 8-year-old nephew Miguel would be getting off at the end of their long driveway in exactly 4 minutes. Miguel, who'd been living with her since the accident that took his parents, her brother and sister-in-law, 3 months ago. Miguel, who barely spoke anymore except to ask when he could go home, a question that broke her heart every single time because this was home now, whether either of them felt ready for it or not. "Aunt Sarah." Miguel's voice carried across the yard, higher pitched than usual. "Whose donkey is that?" She turned to see him running toward them, his backpack bouncing against his small frame, his face more animated than she'd seen it in weeks. The transformation was startling. Color in his cheeks, brightness in his eyes that had been missing since the funeral. "We're not sure, sweetheart," Sarah said carefully, recognizing the dangerous territory they were entering. "He just showed up. Can I pet him?" Miguel was already climbing the fence rails before she could answer. "Miguel, wait." But the boy was already inside the pen, approaching the donkey with the fearless confidence that only children possess. The donkey turned toward him, ears pricked forward with interest rather than alarm. "Hey there, little guy," Miguel whispered, extending his hand. To everyone's surprise, the donkey stepped forward and gently nuzzled the boy's palm, then proceeded to rest his substantial head against Miguel's chest in what looked remarkably like a hug. Miguel's laugh rang out across the ranch yard, the first real laugh Sarah had heard from him since he'd come to live with her. The sound hit her like a physical force, equal parts joy and heartbreak. Pete cleared his throat softly. "Might be worth making a few phone calls," he said quietly. See if we can find where he belongs." Sarah watched her nephew wrap his thin arms around the donkey's neck, watched 23 confused cattle gradually lose interest and return to their breakfast, watched the morning light transform her struggling ranch into something that looked, for just a moment, like hope. "Yeah," she said, knowing full well she hoped those phone calls would turn up nothing. "Let's see what we can find out." The bank notice crinkled in her pocket as she shifted her weight, but somehow it didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Miller ranch as Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching the peculiar scene unfolding in the pasture. Their unexpected visitor had somehow managed to position himself directly between the water trough and the cattle, as if he'd appointed himself the world's most ineffective security guard. The Angus bulls, each weighing easily 10 times more than the scruffy donkey, seemed genuinely perplexed by this development. "Dad, you need to see this," she called over her shoulder. Frank shuffled to the window, coffee mug in hand, his weathered face still creased with sleep. "Well, I'll be damned. That little fella's got more gumption than sense." The donkey stood his ground as Big Jake, their prize bull and notorious troublemaker, approached the water. Instead of moving aside, the donkey simply turned his head and fixed Jake with what could only be described as a stern look. Jake snorted, pawed the ground once for show, then actually stepped back. "Did that donkey just out-intimidate our bull?" Sarah asked, incredulous. "Looks that way," Frank chuckled, the first genuine laugh she'd heard from him in months. "Reminds me of your mother. She was about that size too, but could stare down a grizzly bear when she set her mind to it." The mention of Mom should have stung, but somehow, watching their uninvited guest manage their livestock with nothing but attitude made the memory feel warm instead of painful. Sarah found herself smiling as the donkey finally stepped aside with great dignity, allowing Jake to drink while maintaining what appeared to be supervisory oversight. Tommy burst through the kitchen door, already dressed and practically vibrating with excitement. "Mom, can I go pet him, please? He looks friendly and I promise I'll be careful." "Absolutely not," Sarah said automatically. "We don't know anything about that animal. He could be sick or mean or—" "He's not mean," Frank interrupted, studying the scene outside. "Look how he's handling the cattle. Takes a calm, intelligent animal to do that. Most donkeys would either run or get aggressive." As if summoned by their conversation, Jake's younger brother, Buster, decided to test the new arrival's authority. The young bull lowered his head and charged toward the water trough, clearly expecting the donkey to scatter. Instead, their guest simply sidestepped at the last possible moment, causing Buster to skid past the trough entirely and tumble into the mud wallow behind it. The donkey turned to regard the muddy bull with what Sarah swore was amusement, then let out a sound that was part bray, part snort, and entirely smug. "Okay, that was definitely laughter," Tommy declared, pressing his nose against the window. "He's funny, Mom. Can't we keep him? At least until we find his owner." Frank set down his coffee and reached for his hat. "Boy's got a point about finding the owner. I should check around, see if anyone's missing a donkey, though I can't say I'm in any hurry." He paused at the door. "Been a long time since I've seen anything bring this much life to the place." Sarah watched her father head outside, noting the spring in his step that had been absent since the diagnosis. The donkey spotted Frank approaching and trotted over to the fence with obvious enthusiasm, ears perked forward and tail swishing. "Well, hello there, partner," Frank's voice carried through the window. "Where'd you come from, eh?" The donkey pressed his nose against Frank's outstretched hand, then proceeded to thoroughly investigate the old rancher's shirt pocket. Frank laughed when the searching muzzle found the peppermint candies he always carried. Smart and persistent. "I like that in a ranch hand." Tommy was practically bouncing now. "See? Grandpa likes him too. And look how gentle he is." Sarah had to admit the interaction was sweet. Frank had been increasingly withdrawn lately, spending long hours staring at medical bills and bank statements, the weight of their situation pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. But here he was, scratching behind a strange donkey's ears and grinning like a schoolboy. "What do you think we should name him?" Tommy asked. "We're not naming him," Sarah said firmly, though her resolve was wavering. "He belongs to someone, but what if he doesn't? What if he's just lost and needs a home?" Through the window, they watched Frank lean against the fence rail, talking quietly to their visitor, as if confiding ranch secrets. The donkey listened with apparent attention, occasionally nodding his head in what looked remarkably like understanding. "He's helping Grandpa feel better," Tommy observed, with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Maybe we need him as much as he needs us." Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. They couldn't afford another mouth to feed, couldn't handle another responsibility, couldn't risk getting attached to something else they might lose. But watching her father smile, really smile, for the first time in weeks, she wondered if they could afford not to. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pasture as Jake finished his second cup of coffee, watching the donkey through the kitchen window. 3 days had passed since the creature's arrival, and despite his efforts to locate an owner, no one had come forward to claim it. Sarah had taken to leaving carrots and apples by the fence, though she still maintained a careful distance. "Maybe we should give him a name," she suggested, sliding into the chair across from Jake at the worn wooden table. "Can't keep calling him the donkey forever." Jake grunted non-committally, his attention split between his daughter and the morning's financial calculations scattered across the table. Feed costs were climbing again, and the bank payment loomed like a thundercloud on the horizon. The last thing he needed was another mouth to feed, even one that seemed content with grass and whatever scraps Sarah smuggled outside. "How about Chester?" Sarah continued, undeterred by her father's lack of enthusiasm. "He looks like a Chester to me." Before Jake could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the main pasture. Shouting voices carried on the wind, followed by the thunderous sound of hooves pounding against earth. Jake bolted upright, recognizing the particular panic in his ranch hand's voices that meant trouble with a capital T. Through the window, he could see Manuel running toward the house, his hat clutched in one hand while he gestured wildly with the other. Behind him, a cloud of dust rose from the pasture, where their prize bull, Ferdinand, was supposed to be peacefully grazing. "Boss!" Manuel called out as Jake burst through the screen door. "Ferdinand's gone loco!" Something spooked him bad, and now he's tearing up everything in sight. Jake's heart sank. Ferdinand was worth more than the rest of their livestock combined, a temperamental but valuable Angus bull whose stud fees helped keep the ranch afloat. More importantly, an injured bull was a useless bull, and they couldn't afford either veterinary bills or the loss of income. Racing toward the pasture with Sarah close behind, despite his shouted warnings for her to stay put, Jake could see the scope of the disaster. Ferdinand had somehow gotten himself tangled in a section of wire fencing and was thrashing violently in his attempts to break free. Each movement only made the situation worse, the wire cutting deeper into his legs while his panic escalated to dangerous levels. "Get the wire cutters!" Jake yelled to Carlos, who was maintaining a safe distance from the enraged animal. "And call Doc Peterson." But even as he spoke, Jake knew the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Ferdinand's eyes had rolled back, showing white, and foam flecked his mouth as he bellowed his rage and terror. In this state, the bull was dangerous to anyone who tried to approach, but waiting for the veterinarian might mean watching their most valuable asset injure himself beyond repair. That's when the donkey appeared. Chester, as Sarah had christened him, had somehow wandered closer to the fence, separating him from the chaos. While everyone else maintained a respectful distance from Ferdinand's fury, the donkey simply stood at the fence line, watching with what could only be described as calm interest. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Chester began to bray. It wasn't the harsh, grating sound that donkeys were famous for, but something softer, almost musical. The sound carried across the pasture with an odd, soothing quality that seemed to cut through Ferdinand's panic like a knife through butter. The bull's thrashing slowed, then stopped altogether. His massive head turned toward the sound, ears swiveling forward as Chester continued his strange serenade. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the two animals regarded each other across the fence. "Well, I'll be damned," Carlos whispered, his wire cutters forgotten in his hand. Ferdinand took a tentative step forward, then another, his breathing still labored, but no longer the panicked gasps of a moment before. The wire that had seemed so hopelessly tangled began to loosen as the bull moved more carefully, guided by some instinct that responded to Chester's continued, gentle braying. Jake found himself holding his breath as Ferdinand methodically worked his way free from the fencing, each movement now deliberate and calm. Within minutes, the bull had extracted himself completely and stood in the center of the pasture, no longer the wild-eyed creature of moments before. Chester's braying faded to silence, but he remained at the fence, and Ferdinand remained facing him, as if some understanding had passed between them. "Dad," Sarah whispered, slipping her small hand into Jake's calloused one. "Maybe Chester's supposed to be here." Jake squeezed his daughter's hand, watching as Carlos cautiously approached Ferdinand to assess the damage. Superficial cuts, nothing more. The bull that had been worth more dead than alive just minutes ago would heal completely. For the first time since Martha's death, Jake felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe some things happened for a reason, even on a Tuesday morning when the bills were piling up and the future looked as uncertain as storm clouds on the horizon. The morning sun cast long shadows across the paddock as Jake stood at the fence, watching the donkey graze peacefully among the cattle. 3 days had passed since the animal's arrival, and despite his father's grumbling about another mouth to feed, the creature had somehow integrated itself into the herd with remarkable ease. "You planning to stand there all day, or are you going to help me fix that broken gate?" Tom's voice carried across the yard, tinged with its usual mix of irritation and resignation. Jake reluctantly turned away from the paddock. The donkey looked up at him with those large, knowing eyes, and for a moment Jake could have sworn the animal understood exactly what he was thinking. Which was ridiculous, of course. Animals didn't read minds or solve family problems. They just existed, ate your hay, and eventually left you disappointed. The gate repair turned into a 3-hour ordeal involving rusted hinges, stripped screws, and a mounting pile of colorful language from Tom. Jake held the tools and tried to anticipate his father's needs, but every attempt at helpfulness seemed to irritate the man further. "Not that wrench, the other one," Tom snapped, sweat beading on his forehead. "How many times do I have to tell you the difference between a 9/16 and a 5/8? Sorry, Dad. I thought." "That's the problem right there. You thought." Tom straightened up, his back crackling audibly. "Your brother never had to think about it. He just knew." The familiar weight of Michael's memory settled between them like a lead blanket. Jake's older brother had been the golden child, the one who understood cattle and crops and machinery with an intuitive genius that made everything look effortless. The son who would have inherited the ranch and transformed it into something magnificent. The son who died in a car accident 2 years ago, leaving behind a father who couldn't forgive the world for taking the wrong kid. A commotion from the paddock interrupted Jake's brooding. The cattle were moving in an agitated cluster, lowing nervously as they pressed against the far fence. Tom dropped his wrench and jogged toward the enclosure, Jake close behind. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, scanning the herd for signs of injury or illness. "They were fine 20 minutes ago." That's when they saw it. A massive bull from the neighboring Henderson ranch stood in their pasture, having somehow breached the property line. The animal was easily twice the size of their largest steer, with a temperament to match its intimidating appearance. Henderson's prize-breeding bull was notorious for its aggression, and now it stood between their frightened cattle and the safety of the barn. "Son of a—" Tom started toward the gate, but Jake grabbed his arm. "Dad, don't. That thing will charge anything that moves." Tom shook him off. "Those cattle are worth more than this whole damn ranch. I'm not losing them to Henderson's poorly contained livestock." Before either of them could move, a grey shape trotted purposefully into the paddock. The donkey approached the massive bull with no apparent concern for the size differential or the danger involved. Jake held his breath, certain he was about to witness a tragedy. But something extraordinary happened instead. The donkey began what could only be described as a conversation with the bull, a series of brays, snorts, and body language that seemed to translate across species lines. The bull's aggressive posture gradually relaxed, its massive head lowered, and it actually appeared to be listening. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom whispered. The donkey continued its diplomatic efforts, occasionally moving between the bull and the frightened cattle with the confidence of a seasoned negotiator. Slowly, incredibly, it began guiding the bull toward the break in the fence line where the animal had entered. Not driving or forcing, but leading with a gentle persistence that seemed to hypnotize the massive creature. Within 10 minutes, the bull was back on Henderson property, the cattle had settled down, and the donkey was casually returning to its grazing as if nothing remarkable had occurred. Father and son stood in stunned silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. "That donkey just saved us about $15,000 in cattle," Tom said finally. Jake nodded, still staring at the unlikely hero. "Think Henderson even knows his bull got loose?" "Probably not, and I'm not inclined to tell him, considering what could have happened to our herd." Tom removed his hat and scratched his head. "I've never seen anything like that. It was like that donkey spoke bull." For the first time in months, Jake heard something other than bitterness in his father's voice. There was wonder there, and maybe even a hint of respect. For the donkey, certainly, but Jake dared to hope it might extend a little further. "So, does this mean we're keeping him?" Jake asked. Tom was quiet for a long moment, watching the donkey's peaceful return to normalcy. "I suppose any animal that can handle Henderson's bull deserves a place here. For now." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a start. The morning after Martha's declaration about keeping Clementine, Jake found himself watching his daughter through the kitchen window as she sat cross-legged in the pasture, braiding dandelions into the donkey's mane. For the first time in months, Martha was humming, a soft, tuneless melody that drifted across the yard like a forgotten prayer, finally finding its way home. "She's different," Elena said, appearing beside him with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, evidence of another sleepless night spent wrestling with overdue bills and foreclosure notices. The donkey or Martha? Both. Elena handed him a cup, their fingers brushing in a moment of unexpected tenderness. "I can't remember the last time I heard her laugh." As if summoned by her mother's words, Martha's delighted giggle rang out across the pasture. Clementine had apparently decided the dandelion crown was edible and was methodically munching the yellow blooms, while Martha protested through her laughter. "Clementine, no! You're supposed to wear it, not eat it." Jake couldn't help but smile, though it faded quickly when he spotted Tom Henderson's silver pickup truck rumbling up their gravel drive, dust billowing behind it like a small tornado. Henderson owned the largest spread in 3 counties and had been circling their property like a vulture for months, making increasingly aggressive offers. "Expecting company?" Elena's voice had gone flat, the momentary warmth between them evaporating. "Nothing I can't handle." Jake set down his coffee and headed for the front porch, arriving just as Henderson's boots hit the ground. Tom Henderson was everything Jake wasn't. Prosperous, confident, and utterly convinced that money could solve any problem. His silver belt buckle caught the morning sun as he approached, his smile predatory beneath his expensive hat. "Jake, Elena." He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? What do you want, Tom?" "Straight to business. I like that." Henderson pulled a folded document from his shirt pocket. "I'm prepared to make you an offer you'd be foolish to refuse. Cash deal, no contingencies. You could be free of this place by month's end." The word free hit Jake like a physical blow. Free. As if their life here, their struggles, their memories were nothing more than chains to be broken. "We're not selling." "Jake," Elena's voice carried a warning. They both knew how dire their situation had become. Henderson's laugh was sharp. "Pride's an expensive luxury, friend. My sources tell me the bank's getting impatient." His gaze shifted to where Martha sat with Clementine. Besides, this is no place for a child. She deserves better than watching her parents fail. The comment about Martha struck home, and Jake felt his hands clench into fists. But before he could respond, a commotion erupted from the pasture. "Dad! Mom! Come quick!" Martha's voice had gone shrill with panic. Jake's heart lurched as he spotted the problem. 3 of Henderson's prize Black Angus bulls had somehow gotten through the fence line and were bearing down on Martha and Clementine with the territorial aggression that made bulls dangerous. Martha sat frozen, clutching Clementine's lead rope. "Don't move, baby." Jake vaulted the porch railing and sprinted toward the pasture, Henderson and Elena close behind. But Clementine was already moving. The little donkey stepped protectively in front of Martha, lowering her head and planting her feet. What happened next defied everything Jake thought he knew about barnyard dynamics. Clementine let out a bray that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs, a sound both musical and commanding that stopped the approaching bulls in their tracks. Then, incredibly, she began to move toward them with a strange, dancing gait that was part play, part challenge. The lead bull, a massive creature worth more than Jake's truck, snorted and pawed the ground. But instead of charging, he seemed mesmerized by Clementine's peculiar approach. She pranced closer, then away, closer, then away, somehow conveying both submission and authority in the same movement. Within minutes, she had the 3 bulls following her in a loose line, like children playing follow the leader. She led them in a wide circle around Martha, then guided them toward the broken section of fence with an expertise that left Jake speechless. "Well, I'll be damned," Henderson muttered, his voice filled with reluctant admiration. "That little donkey just herded my bulls like they were house cats." Jake scooped Martha into his arms, his heart still hammering. "You okay, sweetheart?" Martha nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "Clementine protected me, Daddy. She's the bravest donkey in the whole world." Henderson was already walking toward his bulls, shaking his head in amazement. "Where'd you find her, Jake?" "She found us." As Henderson loaded his bulls and departed, without another word about his offer, Jake stood with his arm around Elena, watching their daughter whisper secrets into Clementine's ear. For the first time in months, the future felt less certain, but somehow more hopeful. Maybe heroes came in all sizes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Emma sat on the porch steps, watching Dusty methodically sort through a pile of tangled rope. The donkey had developed an odd fascination with organizing things, and somehow his patient untangling had become a daily ritual that the whole family found strangely soothing. "Would you look at that?" Frank muttered, joining Emma with 2 steaming cups of coffee. "That animal's got more patience than any of us." Emma accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. "Maybe that's what we've been missing around here." Frank studied his daughter's profile, noting how the perpetual tension in her shoulders had begun to ease over the past few weeks. "Your mother always said patience was a virtue I'd never master." She was right about that. Emma's voice held a hint of the old teasing warmth that had been absent since the funeral. "Remember when you tried to teach Tommy to ride? You lasted all of 5 minutes before you were hollering instructions like a drill sergeant." A genuine smile crossed Frank's weathered face. That boy was more interested in feeding the horse than staying on it, kept sliding off to pick clover. They sat in comfortable silence, watching Dusty work. The donkey had somehow managed to separate the rope into neat coils, and now he was arranging them by size with the concentration of a master craftsman. "Frank!" Jake's voice carried across the yard, tinged with excitement. "You need to see this." The foreman was jogging toward them, his usual measured pace replaced by something approaching urgency. Behind him, 3 of the ranch hands followed, their faces mixing bewilderment with amazement. "What's got into you?" Frank stood, immediately alert. "It's the cattle in the north pasture," Jake panted, catching his breath. "They're all grouped together, calm as you please, every last one of them." Frank frowned. "So?" "Frank, These are the same cattle that have been scattering every time we got near them for the past month. The ones we couldn't round up for love or money." Jake gestured toward the pasture. "Now they're standing there like they're waiting for something." Emma rose, her coffee forgotten. "What changed?" "That's just it," said Miguel, one of the younger hands. "Nothing changed except—" He looked embarrassed. "Well, Dusty was up there earlier. We saw him walking among them." "Walking among them? How?" Frank's voice sharpened. "Just walking," Miguel shrugged helplessly, "like he belonged. The cattle didn't spook, didn't run. They just followed him around." Emma felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite name. "Show us." The group made their way across the ranch yard, past the barn where Dusty had finished his rope organization, and was now apparently inspecting the fence posts with the same methodical attention. He looked up at their approach, his ears perked forward in what Emma had come to recognize as his curious expression. "Come on, Dusty," she called softly. "Want to take a walk?" The donkey fell into step beside them, as naturally as if he'd been doing it his whole life. Emma noticed how the other animals they passed seemed to settle at his presence. The chickens stopped their frantic pecking, the barn cats lounged more lazily in the sun, and even Frank's temperamental rooster refrained from his usual aggressive posturing. As they crested the small rise leading to the north pasture, Emma stopped short. Below them, the cattle that had been their nemesis for weeks stood in a loose but orderly group, grazing peacefully. At the sight of Dusty, several of the cows looked up and lowed softly, almost like a greeting. "I'll be damned," Frank breathed. Dusty trotted down the slope, his ungainly gait somehow perfectly suited to the terrain. The cattle parted to make room for him, then closed ranks again, creating a living circle with the little donkey at its center. "It's like he's speaking their language," Jake murmured. Emma watched, transfixed, as Dusty moved through the herd with quiet authority. Where the cattle had been skittish and unpredictable for weeks, they now seemed content and manageable. More than that, they seemed happy. "Think we could move them now?" Frank asked quietly. "Let's try," Jake replied, signaling to the hands to spread out around the herd's perimeter. What followed was the smoothest cattle operation Emma had witnessed in years. With Dusty moving calmly among them, the cows responded to the cowboys' guidance without panic or resistance. They flowed across the pasture like water, following the donkey's lead with an almost magical cooperation. Within an hour, they had successfully moved the entire herd to the lower grazing area, a task that had defeated them repeatedly in recent weeks. Emma scratched behind Dusty's ears as he stood panting lightly from his efforts. "Where did you learn to do that, little guy?" The donkey's only response was a contented sigh, but Emma could have sworn she saw satisfaction in his dark, intelligent eyes. For the first time in months, the future felt possible. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Sarah watched her father emerge from the barn, his shoulders straighter than they'd been in months. Word had spread quickly through Cedar Valley about the miracle donkey who saved Tommy Peterson, and now their phone hadn't stopped ringing. Frank wiped his hands on his jeans and approached her with something she hadn't seen in his eyes since before Mom died: hope. "3 more families called this morning," he said, settling beside her on the porch steps. "Want to bring their kids out to meet Dusty. That Martinez woman from the therapy center in town, she's driving out this afternoon." Sarah nodded, watching Dusty graze peacefully in the pasture. The little donkey had no idea he'd become something of a local celebrity. Tommy had been back twice since the incident, each visit bringing more color to his cheeks and more words tumbling from his previously silent lips. Yesterday, he'd actually laughed when Dusty tried to eat his baseball cap. "Dad," Sarah began carefully, "what if we made this official? I mean, what if Dusty could help other kids too?" Frank's weathered hands stilled on his coffee mug. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" Before Sarah could answer, Jake's truck rumbled up the drive, followed by an unfamiliar sedan. Through the windshield, Sarah could see a professional-looking woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. "That'll be Dr. Martinez," Frank said, rising to his feet. Jake called her after what happened with Tommy. As the introductions were made, Sarah found herself studying Dr. Elena Martinez, who ran the county's largest children's therapy practice. The woman moved with quiet confidence, but her eyes held the same gentle quality that seemed to draw troubled souls, much like Dusty himself. "I've been working with traumatized children for 15 years, Dr. Martinez explained as they walked toward the pasture, "but I've never seen progress like what the Peterson family described. May I meet this remarkable donkey?" Dusty, as if sensing the importance of the moment, trotted over to the fence with his ears pricked forward. Dr. Martinez extended her hand slowly, and the donkey sniffed delicately before allowing her to scratch behind his ears. "Extraordinary," she murmured. "There's something almost therapeutic in his presence, isn't there? Very calming." Jake cleared his throat. "Doc, we were wondering, would there be interest in some kind of program? Bringing kids out here to spend time with Dusty?" Dr. Martinez's eyes lit up. Animal-assisted therapy is incredibly effective, especially for children dealing with trauma, autism, or anxiety disorders. But finding the right animal, with the proper temperament— She paused, watching Dusty nuzzle her shoulder. "This little fellow seems almost intuitive about human emotions." Sarah felt her heart racing. "So it could really work? Kids could come here regularly? With proper setup, insurance, some basic training for you all?" "Absolutely. I have a waiting list of children who could benefit from this type of intervention." Dr. Martinez pulled out her phone. "In fact, there's a young girl I've been working with, Lily. She's been mute since her parents' divorce 6 months ago. Would you be willing to let me bring her out next week?" Frank and Sarah exchanged glances. This was happening faster than either had imagined, but something felt right about it. Frank nodded slowly. "We'd be honored." As Dr. Martinez left with promises to research program requirements and funding possibilities, the family found themselves standing around Dusty's pasture in amazed silence. "Did that really just happen?" Sarah finally asked. Jake grinned. "I think our little troublemaker just found himself a job." Dusty, oblivious to the life-changing conversation that had just occurred, was busy investigating a butterfly that had landed near his hooves. His gentle curiosity and complete lack of self-consciousness made Sarah laugh. "You know what this means," Frank said quietly. "If we do this right, if this program works out, it could save the ranch, give us a real income stream that doesn't depend on cattle prices or weather." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Mom would have loved this. She always said this place was meant to heal hearts. "She did say that," Frank agreed, his voice thick with memory. "Used to joke that our land had magical properties." "Maybe it does," Jake said softly. "Or maybe we just needed the right little donkey to help us find it." As afternoon settled over the ranch, they watched Dusty roll contentedly in his favorite dust patch, completely unaware that he'd just become the cornerstone of their family's future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new children to help, new dreams to chase. But for now, it was enough to stand together, united by hope and the unexpected gift of one lost donkey who'd wandered into their lives at exactly the right moment. The healing had begun for all of them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Sarah watched her father pace the porch, his phone pressed against his ear. Even from the barn, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his free hand kept running through his graying hair. Another creditor, no doubt. The calls had been coming more frequently lately, each one leaving deeper lines etched around his eyes. "Easy there, Buster," she murmured, stroking the donkey's neck as he nuzzled her shoulder. Over the past few weeks, the little grey donkey had become her constant companion, following her through morning chores with an almost dog-like devotion. "Dad's just having one of his worried days." Buster's ears twitched forward, and he let out a soft bray that somehow managed to sound sympathetic. Sarah had to smile despite everything. The donkey had an uncanny ability to read moods, often appearing at exactly the right moment when someone needed comfort. "Sarah!" Her father's voice carried across the yard, sharp with urgency. "Come here, please." She found him standing by the kitchen table, surrounded by a sea of papers and unopened envelopes. His face was pale, and for a moment she was reminded of how he'd looked in the weeks after her mother's death, lost and overwhelmed by responsibilities that seemed too big to handle alone. "What's wrong, Dad?" He held up a letter, his hand trembling slightly. "Thompson's accelerating the loan payments. Says if we can't come up with 15,000 by the end of next week, he's calling in the full amount." Sarah's stomach dropped. 15,000 might as well have been 15 million. They'd been scraping by week to week, selling off equipment and cutting corners wherever possible. The cattle weren't bringing in enough, especially with the drought affecting the grazing land. "There has to be something we can do," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Her father sank into a chair, suddenly looking older than his 55 years. "I've been over the numbers a dozen times. We could sell more cattle, but the market's still down, and we need to keep the breeding stock. The north pasture's still too dry to support a larger herd anyway." A gentle braying outside drew their attention. Through the window they could see Buster standing near the gate, his head tilted as if he was listening to their conversation. Mrs. Henderson was walking up the drive, carrying what looked like a covered casserole dish. "At least someone's having a good day," Sarah's father muttered, but there was a hint of warmth in his voice as he watched the elderly woman pause to scratch Buster's ears. Mrs. Henderson knocked on the screen door, her face bright with excitement. "Jim! Sarah! You'll never guess what happened at the farmer's market yesterday." Sarah let her in, grateful for any distraction from their financial troubles. Mrs. Henderson had been bringing them meals regularly since discovering their situation, despite their protests that she was doing too much. "3 different people asked me about that sweet donkey of yours," she continued, setting the dish on the counter. "Seems word's getting around about his gentle nature. One lady said she'd heard he was wonderful with children, and another mentioned something about him helping with some kind of therapy work." Sarah exchanged a confused glance with her father. "Therapy work?" "Oh, yes. Apparently young Tommy Martinez's mother has been telling everyone how much Buster helped her boy. You remember Tommy, the one who's been having such a hard time since his parents' divorce? Well, his mother brought him by to see Buster a few times, and she says it's the first time in months the child's really opened up and smiled." Sarah remembered the quiet 8-year-old who had indeed visited several times with his mother, always staying close to Buster, who seemed to sense the boy's need for gentle companionship. "The point is," Mrs. Henderson continued, "there might be families willing to pay for that kind of interaction. I know the children's hospital in town has been looking into animal therapy programs." An idea began to form in Sarah's mind, still fragile but growing stronger. "Dad, remember what Doc Wilson said about Buster's temperament? How he'd make a perfect therapy animal?" Her father looked up from his papers, a spark of interest flickering in his tired eyes. "You think there might be something there?" "Mrs. Henderson's right about the children's hospital. And there are retirement homes, special needs centers, places where someone like Buster could make a real difference." Sarah felt excitement building in her chest. It wouldn't be immediate income, but if we could get certified, establish some kind of program. Through the window, Buster stood patiently as a butterfly landed on his nose, not even flinching when it fluttered around his ears. The sight of the gentle donkey's calm acceptance struck Sarah as somehow symbolic. Sometimes the most unexpected solutions came from the most unlikely sources. Her father was quiet for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "It's worth looking into, though we still need to figure out next week." The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Jake lead Burrito through a series of exercises in the corral. 3 weeks had passed since the donkey's heroic rescue, and the change in her son was nothing short of miraculous. Where once there had been sullen silence, now there was animated chatter about training techniques and weekend plans with the 4-H club. "He's out there before dawn every day," Tom said, joining her at the window with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Yesterday I caught him reading that donkey training manual by flashlight under his covers. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. Dr. Martinez says it's the first time she's seen him smile during a session. Really smile, not just that polite one he's been wearing like armor. They watched as Jake guided Burrito through an obstacle course he'd constructed from old ranch materials. The donkey stepped carefully over logs, weaved between barrels, and even allowed Jake to drape a small tarp over his back without flinching. Each successful completion earned Burrito an apple slice and Jake's enthusiastic praise. "Speaking of changes," Tom said carefully, "I got a call from the bank yesterday." Sarah's stomach clenched. "And?" "They want to discuss our account. Seems our recent publicity has attracted some attention." Tom's weathered face broke into an unexpected grin. The good kind of attention. Before Sarah could respond, the phone rang. She grabbed it on the second ring, expecting another reporter or curiosity seeker. Instead, a warm female voice introduced herself as Rebecca Chen from the National Donkey Rescue Foundation. "Mrs. Henderson, we've been following Burrito's story, and we'd like to discuss a partnership opportunity with your ranch." 20 minutes later, Sarah hung up the phone in a daze. Tom raised his eyebrows expectantly. "They want to feature us in their newsletter and website," she said slowly. "Apparently there's a huge need for donkey rehabilitation facilities, and they think our ranch could be perfect for their satellite program." "What does that mean exactly?" "Funding, training, support for taking in rescue donkeys and preparing them for adoption." Sarah felt a flutter of excitement she hadn't experienced in months. It could provide steady income while we rebuild the cattle operation. Tom set down his coffee cup, his expression thoughtful. "We'd be running a donkey rescue, among other things." They mentioned agritourism opportunities too, educational programs, the works. Outside, Jake's laughter echoed across the yard as Burrito attempted to play soccer with an old ball, his technique more enthusiasm than skill. The sound made both parents pause, remembering when laughter had been common in their household. "What do you think Emma would say?" Tom asked quietly. Sarah considered the question seriously. Their daughter had always championed underdogs, whether they were kids being bullied at school or injured animals she'd find and insist on nursing back to health. "I think she'd say we were crazy not to try," Sarah replied. "Remember how she always brought home strays?" Usually right before dinner, Tom chuckled, the memory bittersweet but no longer painful. The kitchen door burst open, and Jake bounded in, dirt-streaked and grinning. "Mom, Dad, you've got to see what Burrito learned. He can shake hands now, and Miguel thinks he might be smart enough to learn how to paint." "Paint?" Sarah blinked. "You know, hold a brush in his mouth and make art. There are videos online of donkeys and elephants doing it. We could sell the paintings at the farmer's market." Tom and Sarah exchanged glances over their son's head. 6 months ago, getting Jake to speak in complete sentences had been a victory. Now he was making entrepreneurial plans involving artistic donkeys. "That's actually not a terrible idea," Tom admitted. Jake's eyes lit up. "Really?" "Because I was also thinking we could offer donkey rides for little kids, and maybe start a petting zoo section, and Burrito could be like the ambassador donkey who shows the new rescues how to trust people again." The boy's words tumbled out in an excited rush, and Sarah felt her heart swell with an emotion she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope mixed with genuine joy. "Slow down there, business mogul," she laughed. "Let's start with the painting lessons and see how that goes." As Jake launched into an elaborate explanation of his research into donkey intelligence, Sarah caught Tom's eye again. He nodded almost imperceptibly, and she knew they were thinking the same thing. Sometimes salvation came in the most unexpected packages. Sometimes healing arrived on 4 hooves with a stubborn streak and an oversized heart. And sometimes, when you thought your world had ended, life surprised you with an entirely new beginning. Outside, Burrito brayed his approval of the morning's activities, the sound carrying across the ranch like a declaration of hope. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching her father load hay bales onto the ancient truck. 3 weeks had passed since the disaster at the county fair, and despite Barnaby's heroic efforts, the medical bills from treating the injured horses had drained their remaining savings. The bank's final notice lay crumpled on the kitchen table behind her. "Dad's pretending everything's fine," Emma said, appearing beside Sarah with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "But I heard him on the phone with Mr. Henderson last night. We have until Friday." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the bitter aroma. 5 days to come up with $30,000. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Might as well be 30 million. Outside, Barnaby trotted alongside Jim's truck as it rumbled toward the far pasture. The little donkey had appointed himself the ranch's official supervisor, following anyone who ventured out to work. His presence had become a comfort to all of them, even Jim, though he'd never admit it aloud. "There has to be something we can do," Emma insisted. "What about selling the cattle?" "Dad already ran those numbers. Even if we sold every head, it wouldn't be enough. And then what? We'd have a ranch with no livestock and no way to make a living." The phone rang, interrupting their grim calculations. Sarah answered with a weary sigh, expecting another creditor or perhaps the bank's attorney. "Is this the Mitchell Ranch?" The voice was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. "Yes, this is Sarah Mitchell." "Miss Mitchell, my name is Janet Phillips. I'm a talent scout with Morrison Entertainment. I was at the county fair 3 weeks ago and witnessed quite an extraordinary display by one of your animals." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm sorry. What kind of talent scout?" "We produce content for television, commercials, films. That donkey of yours, Barnaby, I believe, showed remarkable intelligence and instinct. I've never seen an animal respond to an emergency situation with such awareness and purpose." Emma grabbed Sarah's arm, eyes wide with curiosity. Sarah put the phone on speaker. "I'd like to discuss the possibility of featuring Barnaby in an upcoming commercial campaign. The client is looking for authentic animals with genuine personality. Based on what I witnessed, Barnaby would be perfect." Sarah's heart began to race. What exactly would this involve? A 3-day shoot for a national campaign promoting family values and rural life. The pay would be $15,000 plus expenses. 15,000. Not enough to save the ranch, but a significant start. Sarah looked at Emma, who was practically vibrating with excitement. "We'd be very interested," Sarah said carefully. "When would this happen?" "Next week, if possible. I know it's short notice, but the client is eager to move forward. Would you be available to bring Barnaby to our studio in Dallas?" After exchanging details and promising to call back within the hour, Sarah hung up. She and Emma stared at each other in amazement. $15,000, Emma whispered, for Barnaby being in a commercial. "It's not enough to save the ranch," Sarah reminded her, though her mind was already racing with possibilities. "But maybe if we combine it with selling some cattle, cutting other expenses, or maybe this is just the beginning," Emma said. "Maybe there are other opportunities." They spent the next hour researching Morrison Entertainment online, confirming their legitimacy and reputation. Everything checked out. Janet Phillips was exactly who she claimed to be, and the company had produced numerous successful campaigns. When Jim returned for lunch, they presented the opportunity with barely contained excitement. His reaction was predictably skeptical. "You want to turn Barnaby into some kind of circus act?" "Dad, it's not a circus," Emma protested. "It's legitimate work. And we need the money." Jim sat heavily at the kitchen table, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. The weight of potentially losing the ranch had aged him visibly. What if something happens to him? What if they work him too hard or treat him poorly? "We'll be there the whole time," Sarah assured him. "And if we don't like what we see, we can pull him out." For a long moment, Jim was quiet, staring out the window where Barnaby grazed peacefully among the cattle. The little donkey had integrated so completely into their lives that it was hard to remember the ranch without him. "He's earned the right to choose his own path," Jim said finally. "If you think he can handle it, and if it might help save this place." He paused, then managed a small smile. "Hell, stranger things have happened. A few months ago, I never would have believed a lost donkey would become the best ranch hand I've ever had." Sarah called Janet Phillips back within the hour. By evening, everything was arranged. Barnaby would make his television debut the following Tuesday, completely unaware that his gentle nature and heroic instincts might be exactly what his adopted family needed to survive. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Rodriguez ranch as Maria stood on the front porch, watching her father load the last of his tools into the rusted pickup truck. 3 weeks had passed since the bank's final notice, and today was moving day. The reality of losing their family home hung in the air like dust after a stampede. "Mija, have you seen Benny anywhere?" Elena called from the barn, her voice carrying a note of panic that made Maria's chest tighten. During the chaos of packing, their beloved donkey had somehow slipped away unnoticed. Maria jogged toward the pasture, calling his name, but found only empty fields stretching toward the horizon. A knot formed in her stomach. Losing Benny now would be like losing the last piece of happiness they had left. Meanwhile, 2 miles down the dusty county road, Benny was conducting what could only be described as the most peculiar cattle drive in Texas history. Having wandered onto the neighboring Hartwell Ranch in search of breakfast, he discovered their prized bull, Thunder, stuck neck-deep in a boggy creek bed. The massive Angus was bellowing in frustration, his powerful legs churning uselessly in the thick mud. Benny studied the situation with the calm wisdom of someone who'd spent years solving problems nobody else noticed. He began braying in short, rhythmic bursts, not his usual random honking, but something almost like a pattern. The sound carried across the pasture, reaching the scattered cattle, who lifted their heads with curious interest. What happened next defied every principle of animal behavior the Hartwell family thought they understood. The cattle began moving toward Benny's call, arriving at the creek in a loosely organized group. Thunder, seeing his herd approaching, renewed his struggles with desperate energy. Benny disappeared briefly into a grove of mesquite trees and returned dragging a fallen branch nearly twice his size. With remarkable precision, he positioned it across the narrow part of the creek, creating a makeshift bridge just upstream from where Thunder was trapped. Then he did something extraordinary. He walked out onto the muddy bank and began pushing against the bull's massive flank with his small body, his hooves finding purchase on the slippery surface. The pressure wasn't enough to free Thunder, but it changed the angle just enough for the bull to gain leverage. With a tremendous sucking sound, Thunder hauled himself out of the bog and onto solid ground, covered in mud but unharmed. He stood for a moment, looking down at the small donkey who'd orchestrated his rescue, then gently nuzzled Benny's neck before trotting off to rejoin his herd. Jack Hartwell, who'd been searching frantically for his missing bull, arrived just in time to witness the tail end of this unlikely rescue. He stood frozen, trying to process what he'd just seen. This was the same worthless donkey the Rodriguez family was supposedly too attached to see clearly. By afternoon, word of Benny's heroics had spread through the county's tight-knit ranching community like wildfire. Thunder wasn't just any bull. He was worth more than most people's houses and represented the future of the Hartwell breeding program. Jack found himself driving toward the Rodriguez ranch, his mind wrestling with an idea that seemed impossible and perfectly logical at the same time. He arrived to find the family loading their last possessions, Maria sitting dejectedly on the porch steps, while Elena searched the far pastures for Benny. The sight of their obvious heartbreak stirred something in Jack's chest that had been dormant since his own wife's death 5 years earlier. "Carlos," Jack called out as he approached, "we need to talk." The conversation that followed would later become local legend. Jack explained what he'd witnessed, his voice filled with amazement that grew with each detail. He talked about Thunder's value, about how Benny's quick thinking had prevented a catastrophic loss, about debts and favors and the unwritten codes that held rural communities together. "I'm prepared to buy your ranch," Jack said finally, "at fair market value, enough to clear your debts and then some. But I have one condition." Carlos felt his heart hammering. "What condition?" "The donkey stays with the property. I'm thinking about expanding into agritourism, maybe some kind of educational program about animal intelligence. Benny would be the star attraction." Elena appeared around the corner of the barn, leading a somewhat sheepish-looking Benny who was sporting fresh mud stains and carrying himself with unmistakable pride. Upon seeing the gathered humans, he ambled over and casually nudged Jack's hand, as if greeting an old friend. Maria looked from her parents to Jack, hardly daring to hope. "But where would we live?" Jack smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Well, I've got a big house that's been too quiet for too long, and this ranch is going to need experienced managers. Interested in the job?" As if understanding every word, Benny let out a triumphant bray that echoed across the pastures, causing the cattle in the distance to lift their heads and answer back in what sounded remarkably like applause. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barnyard as Emma carried a bucket of oats toward Buster's makeshift stall. 3 weeks had passed since the donkey had wandered onto their property, and somehow the ranch felt more alive than it had in months. She could hear her father's voice drifting from the equipment shed, actually humming while he worked on the old tractor. When was the last time Dad had hummed? Buster greeted her with his usual enthusiastic bray, ears perked forward and tail swishing. "Good morning to you too, you silly beast," Emma laughed, scratching behind his ears. The donkey had filled out considerably since his arrival, his coat now glossy and his eyes bright with mischief. "Emma!" Her father's voice carried a note of urgency that made her stomach clench. She'd grown to fear that tone over the past year. It usually meant another bill they couldn't pay or another piece of bad news about the ranch's future. She found him standing by the fence line that bordered the Hendersons' property, his weathered hands gripping the wooden rail. "What is it, Dad?" "Look." He pointed toward the neighboring pasture where a small cluster of cattle stood near their fence. "Those aren't our cows." Emma squinted against the morning glare. He was right. The cattle bore the Henderson brand, and they were definitely on the wrong side of the property line. "How did they get over here?" "Storm last week must have taken down part of their fence. See there?" Her father gestured toward a section where wooden posts lay splintered and wire fencing drooped uselessly. "Problem is, if those cattle cause any damage to our property, we're liable. And if they get spooked and run off, Henderson will blame us." Emma's heart sank. The Hendersons had been feuding with neighboring ranchers for years over property disputes and liability issues. Her father couldn't afford another legal battle, not when they were already hanging on by a thread financially. "What do we do?" "We need to get them back where they belong, but cattle can be unpredictable. If we approach them wrong, they could scatter or charge." Her father removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. "I'll have to call Henderson, though he'll probably accuse us of cutting his fence ourselves." Before Emma could respond, a familiar braying sound made them both turn. Buster had somehow escaped his stall and was trotting purposefully toward the fence line, his ears alert and his gait confident. "Buster, no!" Emma called, but the donkey ignored her completely. To their amazement, Buster squeezed through a gap in the fence and approached the cattle with remarkable calm. Instead of spooking the animals, his presence seemed to intrigue them. The lead cow, a massive Holstein with distinctive black patches, lowered her head to investigate this strange newcomer. "Well, I'll be damned," her father muttered. Buster circled the small herd slowly, making soft, chuffing sounds that Emma had never heard before. The cattle responded by moving closer together, but not in fear, more like they were following his lead. When Buster began walking back toward the broken section of fence, the cattle fell into line behind him. "Is he actually herding them?" Emma whispered, afraid to speak too loudly and break the spell. Her father nodded in wonder. "Natural herding instinct. Some donkeys have it stronger than others. Never seen anything quite like this, though." Buster guided the cattle through the fence gap with the patience of a seasoned ranch dog. Once they were safely back on Henderson property, he turned and trotted back to Emma and her father, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "Good boy," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. "Such a good boy." The sound of an approaching truck made them all look up. Emma's stomach dropped as she recognized Tom Henderson's dusty red pickup bouncing down the dirt road. The man himself was exactly as unpleasant as his reputation suggested, red-faced, perpetually angry, and quick to blame others for his problems. Henderson climbed out of his truck with a scowl already fixed on his face. "Murphy, what the hell are you doing with my cattle?" Emma's father straightened, preparing for a confrontation, but Emma stepped forward. "Actually, Mr. Henderson, your cattle wandered onto our property through that broken fence. We just helped get them back where they belong." "Likely story," Henderson sneered. "Probably cut that fence yourselves to—" He stopped mid-sentence as he noticed Buster standing calmly beside Emma, still wearing wisps of hay from his morning meal. The donkey regarded Henderson with what could only be described as polite interest. "That your donkey?" Henderson asked, his tone shifting slightly. "Yes, sir," Emma replied. "He's the one who herded your cattle back through the fence." Henderson studied the scene, his cattle now peacefully grazing where they belonged, the obviously storm-damaged fence, and the small donkey who had somehow managed to accomplish what usually required several experienced ranch hands. For the first time since Emma had known him, Tom Henderson looked genuinely surprised. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pasture as Sarah watched Diego carefully wrap Clementine's injured leg. The donkey stood perfectly still, as if she understood the gravity of her situation. 3 days had passed since the accident, and while the swelling had gone down, the limp remained pronounced. "She's healing, but slowly," Diego murmured, running his weathered hands along Clementine's flank. "The good news is nothing's broken. The bad news is she won't be doing any more cattle herding for a while." Sarah's heart sank. Without Clementine's unique ability to calm and guide the herd, they'd already lost 2 more steers to the creek ravine. The bank had called twice this week, and each conversation felt like a countdown to losing everything her father had built. "There has to be something else we can do," Jack said, leaning against the fence post. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights spent poring over ranch finances and half-finished letters to his late wife. Margaret emerged from the house carrying a tray of coffee and her famous cinnamon rolls. At 73, she moved with purpose despite her arthritic joints. "You know, I've been thinking about what Pastor Williams said last Sunday about using the gifts we're given." "What do you mean, Grandma?" Sarah accepted the steaming mug gratefully. "Well, we've been so focused on what Clementine can't do right now that we haven't considered what she still can do." Margaret's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Remember how the Henderson kids reacted when they saw her last month?" Sarah thought back to their neighbor's visit. 8-year-old Emma had been terrified of horses, but she'd immediately gravitated toward Clementine, spending an entire afternoon brushing her coat and feeding her carrots. "The petting zoo idea?" Jack shook his head. "Mom, we're cattle ranchers, not entertainers." "Are we, though?" Margaret's voice carried gentle challenge. "Right now, we're people trying to save our home. Maybe it's time to think differently." Diego cleared his throat. "My sister runs educational programs at the community college. She's always looking for ways to teach kids about farm life, but most places are too dangerous or don't want the liability." Sarah felt a spark of possibility. "You mean like school field trips?" "Exactly. Clementine's perfect for it. Gentle, patient, great with children. And we could show them the other animals too, teach them about sustainable farming." Jack remained skeptical until Margaret pulled out her phone and showed him the website she'd been researching. "Look at this place in Colorado. They make more from educational tourism than they ever did from cattle alone." Over the next hour, ideas began flowing like water, breaking through a dam. They could offer birthday parties, summer camps, even therapeutic riding programs once Clementine fully healed. The old barn could be converted into a classroom space, and the unused pasture near the house was perfect for supervised activities. "But what about the cattle operation?" Jack asked. "We scaled down to what we can manage," Sarah said, surprising herself with her decisiveness. "Keep the best breeding stock. Focus on quality over quantity. The educational programs could provide steady income while we rebuild. Margaret clapped her hands together. I knew that business degree of yours would come in handy eventually. As they discussed logistics, Clementine wandered closer, her injured leg barely touching the ground. She nuzzled Sarah's shoulder, and for a moment, Sarah could swear the donkey understood exactly what they were planning. There's something else, Diego said quietly. My nephew Carlos just graduated with a teaching degree, but he can't find work. He grew up on a ranch and loves working with kids. Could we afford to hire him? Sarah asked. Margaret's smile grew wider. I may have a small nest egg tucked away. Consider it an investment in our future. Jack looked around at the three faces watching him expectantly, then down at Clementine, who gazed back with those impossibly expressive brown eyes. You really think this could work? I think, Margaret said, reaching out to stroke Clementine's neck, that sometimes the best gifts come in the most unexpected packages. This little lady taught us that. That afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting in the pasture with Clementine, laptop balanced on her knees as she researched permits and insurance requirements. The donkey grazed peacefully nearby, occasionally looking up as if checking on her progress. You know, Sarah said aloud, 6 months ago I thought coming home was giving up on my dreams. Turns out maybe I just needed to dream bigger. Clementine lifted her head and made a soft huffing sound that Sarah chose to interpret as agreement. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jack joined them in the pasture. For the first time in months, his shoulders didn't carry the weight of impending defeat. Your mother would have loved this, he said softly. Sarah reached for his hand. She would have loved seeing us fight for what matters. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pasture as Sarah walked toward the fence line, her boots crunching through the frost-kissed grass. 3 weeks had passed since the county fair, and the ranch felt different now, alive in ways she'd forgotten were possible. The mortgage payment had bought them time, but more importantly, it had bought them hope. Buster stood near the gate, his ears perked forward as he watched her approach. The donkey's coat had filled out considerably since his arrival, and his eyes held that familiar spark of mischief that had become as much a part of the ranch's daily rhythm as the sunrise itself. Morning, hero, Sarah said, scratching behind his ears. Ready for another adventure? As if in response, Buster let out one of his characteristic brays that seemed to echo across the entire valley. From the barn she could hear her father's laughter, a sound that had become wonderfully common again. He was preparing for the morning chores, moving with an energy she hadn't seen in months. The cattle dotting the hillside looked healthier than they had in years. Dr. Martinez had been amazed at their condition during his last visit, attributing their improved health to reduced stress levels. Animals pick up on the emotional climate around them, he'd explained. Whatever changed here, it's working. Sarah knew exactly what had changed. It wasn't just Buster's presence, though the donkey had certainly been the catalyst. It was the way the family had learned to hope again, to see possibility instead of just problems. Even Jake had been calling more often, his voice lighter during their conversations. Sarah, her father's voice carried across the yard. Come see this. She found him in the barn, holding an envelope with the logo of the state agricultural department. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, and Sarah held her breath. We've been selected, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The sustainable farming grant. We got it. Sarah blinked, certain she'd misheard. Dad, we never applied for a grant. I did, he said, grinning sheepishly. Last month, after the fair. Figured we had nothing to lose and everything to gain. It's enough to modernize our irrigation system and improve our pasture management. Real money, Sarah. Enough to make this place what it could be. The envelope fluttered from his fingers as Sarah threw her arms around him. Outside, Buster brayed again, as if he somehow knew about their good fortune. There's more, her father continued, retrieving a second letter. The tourism board wants to feature us in their agritourism campaign. Come meet Buster, the county fair champion, they want to say. They're offering to help us set up educational tours, maybe even a small petting zoo. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Educational tours meant steady income, diversification beyond just cattle. It meant stability she'd never dared to imagine. "Dad, this is incredible, but are you sure you want strangers tramping around the ranch every weekend?" "Honey, if the last few months have taught me anything, it's that sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places." He gestured toward the pasture where Buster was now engaged in what appeared to be a staring contest with their oldest bull, Jeremiah. "Besides, that donkey loves an audience." As if to prove his point, Buster suddenly sprang into action, chasing a butterfly in wide, exaggerated circles that sent the cattle scattering in amusement rather than alarm. Even Jeremiah seemed to be enjoying the entertainment. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, heard about the grant. "Celebration dinner tonight? I'm buying." She smiled, typing back her acceptance. Marcus had been around more often lately, helping with repairs and staying for dinner. Their friendship had deepened into something warmer, though neither had rushed to put a name on it. Time felt less urgent now, less fraught with desperation. "Oh, and Sarah," her father added, tucking the letters into his shirt pocket. "Mrs. Henderson called this morning. Apparently, 3 more families in the valley have taken in rescue donkeys. Says Buster started a trend. A donkey revolution." Sarah laughed. Who would have thought? The sound of an approaching vehicle made them both look up. Jake's pickup truck was bumping down the dirt road, dust trailing behind it like a victory banner. Sarah's heart leaped. He wasn't supposed to visit until next month. Her brother emerged from the truck with his familiar crooked grin, but something was different about his posture, more relaxed somehow. "Heard there was some celebrating to do around here," he called out. "Thought I'd come home and join the party." Home. He'd called it home. Buster, who had apparently appointed himself the ranch's official welcoming committee, trotted over to investigate the newcomer with his usual lack of personal boundaries. Jake laughed, actually laughed, as the donkey began systematically searching his pockets for treats. "I see our 4-legged savior is still running the show," Jake said, producing an apple from his jacket. "Absolutely," Sarah replied, "and we wouldn't have it any other way." The morning sun cast long shadows across the Hartley ranch as Sarah stood on the front porch, watching Barnaby graze peacefully in the far pasture. 3 months had passed since the donkeys' heroic defense of their cattle, and the ranch bore little resemblance to the struggling operation it had been. New fencing gleamed in the early light. The barn sported fresh red paint, and the sound of healthy cattle lowing drifted across the fields. "Mom, have you seen my boots?" Emma called from inside the house, her voice carrying the breathless urgency of a teenager running late for school. Sarah smiled, remembering when getting Emma to speak at all had been a victory. Now daughter chattered constantly about her friends, her classes, and especially about the regional rodeo competition she'd qualified for next month. The same girl who had refused to leave her room was now training daily on Buttercup, with Barnaby serving as her most devoted cheerleader. Tom emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag. His limp was barely noticeable now, though Sarah suspected it had less to do with physical healing and more with the lightness that had returned to his step. The insurance settlement from the rustling incident had covered their debts and provided enough capital for improvements, but it was Tom's renewed sense of purpose that had truly transformed him. "That donkey's at it again," he said, pointing toward the pasture where Barnaby stood alert, ears pricked forward as he surveyed the herd. "Found him this morning positioned right between the new calves and the fence line. It's like he's appointed himself head of security." Sarah laughed, watching as Barnaby trotted importantly between the cattle, occasionally nuzzling a calf or standing protectively near the pregnant cows. The veterinarian had declared him the healthiest donkey he'd ever examined, though he'd been puzzled by the animal's unusual attachment to cattle. "He knows he belongs here," Sarah said simply. Emma burst through the screen door, boots in hand and backpack slung over her shoulder. At 16, she'd grown taller and stronger, her face bright with the confidence that came from having survived real hardship and emerged victorious. She paused to pull on her boots, hopping on one foot in a way that reminded Sarah of the little girl Emma had been. "Don't forget I'm staying after school for livestock judging practice," Emma said, straightening up. "Coach Martinez thinks I have a real shot at state-level competition." "Your father's picking you up at 6, Sarah replied, then added with mock sternness, "and no sneaking treats to Barnaby during lunch break. He's getting spoiled." Emma grinned, the same mischievous expression that had once driven Sarah to distraction but now filled her with joy. "I make no promises," she called over her shoulder as she jogged toward the school bus stop. Tom joined Sarah on the porch, slipping his arm around her waist. They stood in comfortable silence, watching their transformed world. The morning routine that had once felt like drudgery now hummed with purpose and contentment. Even the challenges seemed manageable when faced together. "I got a call from Jim Morrison yesterday," Tom said eventually. "He wants to know if we'd be interested in expanding our herd. Apparently, word's gotten around about our security system." He nodded toward Barnaby, who was now leading a small parade of calves toward the water trough. "Says he's never seen cattle so calm and well protected." Sarah considered this, remembering how different their conversations had been just months ago, when every phone call brought bad news and every decision felt impossible. "What do you think?" "I think we should talk to Emma about it. This is her operation as much as ours now." The truth of this statement settled between them comfortably. Emma's transformation from grieving, angry teenager to responsible ranch hand had surprised everyone except Barnaby, who had somehow recognized her potential from the beginning. She managed the ranch's social media accounts, tracking their small but growing reputation for raising healthy, stress-free cattle, and her before and after photos of Barnaby had garnered thousands of followers. "Sometimes I wonder where he came from," Sarah mused, watching as Barnaby carefully positioned himself to provide shade for a resting calf. "What kind of life he had before he found us." Tom squeezed her shoulder. "Maybe that's not the important question anymore." A truck turned into their driveway, and Sarah recognized the veterinarian's vehicle. Dr. Peterson had become a regular visitor, fascinated by Barnaby's integration with the cattle herd and eager to document what he called interspecies guardian behavior. But Sarah suspected the older man simply enjoyed witnessing their unlikely success story. As Dr. Peterson climbed out of his truck, Barnaby lifted his head and brayed a greeting that seemed to echo across the entire ranch. The sound that had once startled Sarah with its foreignness now felt like the voice of home itself, calling them all together into whatever adventure awaited. Sarah stepped off the porch to greet their visitor, her heart full of gratitude for the gentle creature who had wandered into their lives and taught them that sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms. The morning of the county fair dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden light that made even the rustiest fence posts look magical. Martha stood at the kitchen window, watching as Sam led Buster toward the freshly painted livestock trailer. The donkey's coat gleamed from yesterday's thorough grooming, and someone had braided tiny wildflowers into his mane, Clara's handiwork, no doubt. "You ready for this, old girl?" Frank asked, appearing beside her with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Martha accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. "About as ready as anyone can be for parading their prized donkey in front of half the county." She paused, then smiled. "Did I just say prized donkey?" Frank chuckled. "You sure did, and you meant it." Outside, the organized chaos of departure was underway. Clara darted between the truck and trailer, checking and rechecking their supplies, grooming brushes, Buster's favorite treats, the blue ribbon from last week's impromptu neighborhood competition, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Buster, Hero of Harmony Ranch," in Clara's careful cursive. Tom emerged from the barn carrying a fresh bale of hay, his movements more energetic than they'd been in months. The physical therapy was working, but Martha suspected Buster's companionship deserved equal credit for her husband's improved spirits. Tom had taken to reading the morning paper aloud to the donkey, claiming Buster needed to stay informed about current events. "Dad, you're going to love this," Sam called out, backing Buster toward the trailer ramp. "Watch how he loads himself." Sure enough, Buster walked calmly up the ramp as if he'd been doing it his entire life. No coaxing, no bribing with carrots, just the steady confidence of an animal who trusted his people completely. "Show off," Tom muttered, but his eyes sparkled with pride. The drive to the fairgrounds took 40 minutes, winding through valleys where other ranchers' trucks dotted the roads like a parade of hope and determination. At a red light, Martha noticed the family in the vehicle beside them. Parents in their best Western shirts, kids pressed against windows, a horse trailer swaying gently behind them. Everyone was heading to the same place, carrying the same mixture of excitement and nerves. The fairgrounds buzzed with organized pandemonium. Vendors hawked everything from kettle corn to hand-tooled leather belts, while children clutched balloons and pointed excitedly at the livestock barns. The air carried a mixture of hay, cotton candy, and that distinctive county fair smell that triggered memories of summers past. Finding their assigned space in the small animals' barn, the family worked together to set up Buster's temporary home. Clara had insisted on bringing his favorite blanket, the ratty old thing he'd claimed from the tack room, and she spread it carefully in the corner of the stall. "Folks, meet your competition," Sam announced, nodding toward the neighboring stalls. Martha surveyed the scene with growing amusement. There was Gertrude, a pristine white goat wearing what appeared to be a professional grooming job and a rhinestone halter. Beyond her, a miniature pig named Sir Francis Bacon posed regally while his owner applied hoof polish. Even the chickens looked like they'd stepped out of a poultry magazine. "Well, Buster," Tom said, scratching behind the donkey's ears, "you're certainly going to stand out in this crowd." As if sensing the attention, Buster let out one of his signature brays, a sound that somehow managed to be both ridiculous and endearing. Several nearby animals responded with their own calls, creating a brief barnyard symphony that had everyone laughing. "Ladies and gentlemen," boomed a voice over the loudspeaker, "judging for the small animals competition will begin in 30 minutes. Please have your animals ready for presentation." Clara's eyes widened. 30 minutes? Is that enough time to— "Honey," Martha interrupted gently, "Buster's been ready for this his whole life. He just didn't know it." As if to prove her point, Buster stretched his neck over the stall door and began charming a group of visiting children. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the donkey's gentle nature and the family's obvious affection for their unusual champion. An elderly woman in overalls and a county fair volunteer badge approached their stall. "Excuse me," she said, studying Buster with interest, "but isn't this the donkey I read about in the paper? The one who saved your ranch?" Before anyone could answer, Clara stepped forward with the confidence of a seasoned publicist. "Yes, ma'am, this is Buster. He's not just a pet, he's family, and he's taught us that sometimes the most important victories don't come with ribbons attached." The volunteer smiled, making notes on her clipboard. "Well, young lady, I think the judges are going to be very interested in hearing that story." As the announcement for lineup echoed through the barn, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the pure, uncomplicated joy of being exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right people, celebrating exactly the right donkey. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Sarah stepped onto the front porch, coffee mug in hand. 3 months had passed since the bank's decision, and the changes were remarkable. Where once stood weathered fencing, new posts gleamed white in the dawn light. The pastures, previously sparse and patchy, now rolled green and lush with healthy grass that swayed in the gentle breeze. "Morning, Buster!" she called out, watching the grey donkey lift his head from where he grazed contentedly among the cattle. His ears perked forward at the sound of her voice, and she could swear he smiled before returning to his breakfast. Jake emerged from the barn, his shoulders no longer carrying the weight of impending doom that had hunched them for so long. "Feed's holding up well," he announced, wiping his hands on a clean work shirt. "Should last us through the month with plenty to spare." The sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention to the main road. A dusty pickup truck turned into their driveway, and Sarah recognized the weathered face of Tom Morrison from the neighboring ranch. Behind him came another truck, then another. "Expecting company?" Jake asked, raising an eyebrow. Sarah shook her head, but her confusion quickly melted into warmth as she realized what was happening. Tom stepped out of his truck, followed by a dozen other ranchers from the valley. Each carried tools, supplies, or covered dishes that promised a feast. "Figured it was time for a proper barn raising," Tom announced with a grin. "That old storage barn of yours has been looking mighty sorry for itself." "Tom, we can't ask you all to—" Jake started, but the older rancher waved him off. "Nobody's asking, we're offering. Besides, Buster there saved my prize heifer last month when she wandered into that ravine. Least I can do is swing a hammer in his honor." As if summoned by his name, Buster trotted over to investigate the gathering crowd. Children tumbled out of truck beds, immediately gravitating toward the gentle donkey who had become something of a local celebrity. Emma, now 13 and having shed much of her earlier shyness, took charge of the younger kids with natural authority. "His ears are so soft," squealed little Amy Patterson, stroking Buster's neck while he stood perfectly still, patient as a saint. "He likes carrots best," Emma instructed seriously. "But apples are good too. Just don't give him too many, or Mom will lecture us about donkey nutrition." The laughter that followed was music to Sarah's ears. When had Emma become so confident, so open with others? The change had been gradual but unmistakable, coinciding perfectly with Buster's arrival in their lives. By noon, the frame of the new barn was taking shape. Jake worked alongside neighbors he'd barely spoken to in years, his hammer keeping time with theirs in a rhythm that spoke of community and belonging. The women had taken over the kitchen, filling it with the kind of chatter and laughter that made a house feel truly alive. "Your boy's got good hands," Tom observed, nodding toward where Billy helped younger children safely observe the construction. At 15, Billy had grown into his frame, his movements confident and purposeful. "Reminds me of his grandfather." Jake's throat tightened at the mention of his father, but it was a good ache now, filled with pride rather than regret. "Dad would have loved this," he murmured. "He's seeing it," Tom replied quietly. "Count on it." As the afternoon wore on, Buster appointed himself supervisor of the entire operation. He wandered from group to group, accepting pets and treats with regal grace, occasionally braying what sounded suspiciously like approval or gentle correction when someone's hammering went off rhythm. "That donkey's got more sense than most foremen I've worked for," chuckled Pete Williams, pausing to scratch Buster's chin. "Maybe we should put him in charge of the whole project." The sun was setting by the time the last nail was driven home. The new barn stood proud and sturdy, its fresh lumber gleaming golden in the fading light. Sarah stood in its doorway, overwhelmed by the generosity that had transformed not just their property, but their entire sense of place in the world. "Thank you," she whispered to Buster as he wandered over to stand beside her. "For all of it." The donkey leaned his warm, solid weight against her leg, and she felt the last piece of her heart settle back into place. This odd, gentle creature had wandered into their lives at exactly the right moment, bringing with him not just hope, but a reminder of what truly mattered. As the neighbors packed up their tools and prepared to head home, Jake slipped his arm around Sarah's waist. Their children flanked them, Billy's hand resting on Buster's neck, while Emma fed him one last carrot. The ranch was saved, their family was whole, and tomorrow would bring new adventures. Sometimes the most unexpected gifts came on 4 legs with long ears and an even longer heart.